Los Angeles, California. October 19, 1982. 7:23 a.m. The hotel room door opens. John DeLorean, the most flamboyant, most brilliant, most controversial automobile executive in America, walks in wearing a suit that costs more than most people's monthly salary. He is 57 years old. He is 6 feet 4 inches tall. He has the jawline of a movie star and the confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. He is carrying a briefcase. In the briefcase, according to the men waiting in the room, is $1.8 million in cash. The men waiting in the room are not cocaine dealers. They are FBI agents, and the cameras hidden in the walls have been recording for hours. John DeLorean looks at the cocaine on the table. He looks at the men around it, and he says something that the cameras record with perfect clarity, something that his lawyers will spend the next 2 years trying to explain to a jury. He says, "It's as good as gold." In that moment, the most extraordinary automotive career in American history ends, not with a car, not with an engineering triumph or a business failure, with a hotel room, and a briefcase, and the specific sound of handcuffs. To understand how John DeLorean ended up in that hotel room, you have to understand who John DeLorean was, and what he had built, and what he had lost, and what desperation does to brilliant men when everything they have created is about to disappear. John Zachary DeLorean was born in 1925 in Detroit, Michigan, the son of Romanian immigrants. His father was an auto worker at Ford. His childhood was poor and unstable. His parents divorced when he was young, and he grew up in the particular grinding poverty of Depression-era Detroit that left its mark on everyone it touched. He was saved by engineering. He discovered early and completely that he had a gift for understanding mechanical systems, for seeing how things worked and how they could work better. He studied at the Lawrence Institute of Technology and then at the Chrysler Institute of Engineering. And by the time he was in his 30s, he had arrived at General Motors with a resume that made the company's recruiters pay attention. At GM, DeLorean was everything the corporation simultaneously needed and feared. He was brilliant. His engineering instincts were extraordinary. He understood performance in a way that most GM executives, focused on sales figures and market research and the conservative preferences of suburban family car buyers, did not naturally possess. He was also impossible. He wore Italian suits to meetings where everyone else wore gray flannel. He drove to work in sports cars while his colleagues drove company sedans. He dated models and actresses and eventually married them. 4 times, each wife younger and more glamorous than the last. He gave interviews in which he said things about GM's management that GM's management did not appreciate reading in the morning paper, and he produced results that made all of it temporarily acceptable. The Pontiac GTO. In 1964, John DeLorean was the chief engineer of Pontiac, and he did something that the conventional wisdom of the American automobile industry said was impossible. He put a large displacement high-performance engine into a mid-size family car and created a vehicle that cost $2,500 and would do 0 to 60 in 6 seconds. The muscle car was born. The GTO, Gran Turismo Omologato, the name borrowed from Ferrari, was not supposed to exist. GM had a corporate policy against putting engines larger than 330 cubic inches in mid-size cars. DeLorean had circumvented the policy by technically classifying the GTO as an option package rather than a separate model. By the time GM's management understood what had happened, the GTO was selling faster than the factory could build it. 32,000 units in the first year, 75,000 the second year, 100,000 the third. DeLorean had created a market that nobody knew existed. Young Americans who wanted performance and couldn't afford a sports car, and he had created it by ignoring the rules of the institution he worked for. This was his genius, and it was his template. He rose through GM with extraordinary speed, to head of Chevrolet, to group executive vice president, to the position from which the presidency of the entire corporation was clearly visible. He was, by the early 1970s, the most talked-about executive in the American automobile industry, and then he walked away. The reasons DeLorean gave for leaving GM in 1973 were various and not entirely consistent. Dissatisfaction with corporate culture, desire to pursue his own vision, belief that the large manufacturers were fundamentally incapable of innovation. All of these were true. None of them was the complete truth. The complete truth was that John DeLorean wanted to build his car. Not GM's car. Not a car designed by committee and approved by market research and compromised by cost accountants. A car that expressed a vision, his vision, of what an automobile could be. He had been designing it in his head for years. It would have gull-wing doors, the dramatic upward-opening design that made every entry and exit a statement. It would have a stainless steel body, unpainted, brushed, unlike anything else on the road. It would have a rear-mounted engine for optimal weight distribution. It would be mid-priced, not a Ferrari, not a Corvette, but something genuinely attainable for the enthusiast who wanted a sports car that looked like the future. He called the company the DeLorean Motor Company. He called himself the chairman. He raised money from investors who believed in his name, his reputation, his track record, and then he made the decision that would ultimately destroy everything. He decided to build the factory in Northern Ireland. The British government, desperate for investment in a region torn apart by the Troubles, the sectarian violence between Protestant Unionists and Catholic nationalists that had been consuming Northern Ireland for a decade, offered DeLorean an extraordinary package, $54 million in grants and loans to build his factory in Dunmurry, outside Belfast. It was, on paper, a remarkable opportunity. Free money, essentially, to build the factory that would produce the car of the future. It was, in practice, a catastrophe in slow motion. The workforce had no experience with automotive manufacturing. The management systems were inadequate for the complexity of the production challenges. The car itself, designed with ambition that consistently outran the engineering solutions needed to support it, had quality problems that the factory could not resolve and that reviewers noted with increasing bluntness. The PRV V6 engine, sourced from a Peugeot-Renault-Volvo joint venture, produced 130 horsepower. Adequate, but not inspiring in a car that had been promised as a performance vehicle. The gull-wing doors, while spectacular, had engineering compromises that made them difficult to open from the inside in certain crash positions. The stainless steel body scratched in ways that conventional paint did not. The car looked extraordinary. It drove well enough. It was not what John DeLorean had promised. Sales began disappointingly and grew worse as early buyers reported quality issues and the automotive press delivered verdicts that ranged from lukewarm to damning. By 1982, the DeLorean Motor Company was consuming cash faster than it could generate it. The factory in Belfast was running at a fraction of capacity. The British government, which had already put in far more money than the original agreement specified, was losing patience. John DeLorean needed $17 million to keep the company alive. He had run out of legitimate options. The man who approached DeLorean in the summer of 1982 presented himself as a drugs dealer who could help solve the cash problem. His name was James Hoffman. He was a convicted drug smuggler who had become an FBI informant. Hoffman told DeLorean that he could arrange a cocaine deal. DeLorean would invest in a cocaine shipment, the cocaine would be sold, and DeLorean would use his profits to save the company. DeLorean, by his own later account, believed he had no choice. The company was days from collapse. 800 workers in Belfast would lose their jobs. Everything he had built, the car, the factory, the dream, was about to disappear. He agreed. What followed was one of the most extensively documented law enforcement operations in American history. The FBI recorded every meeting, every phone call, every transaction. They recorded DeLorean inspecting cocaine in a hotel room. They recorded him discussing the deal. They recorded him saying in reference to the cocaine, "It's as good as gold." On October 19, 1982, John DeLorean was arrested. 2 weeks later, DeLorean Motor Company went into receivership. The factory in Belfast closed. The workers were let go. The car that had been designed to represent the future sat in dealerships across America, selling for less than its original price to buyers who wanted a piece of automotive history at a discount. The trial lasted 2 years. DeLorean's defense was entrapment, the argument that the FBI, through its informant James Hoffman, had induced him to commit a crime he would not otherwise have committed. His lawyers presented evidence that Hoffman had been the initiating force in the cocaine scheme, that DeLorean had been desperate and manipulated, that the government had essentially created the crime it then prosecuted. In August 1984, the jury acquitted John DeLorean on all charges. The verdict was stunning. The evidence, captured on video, had seemed overwhelming, but the jury had found the FBI's conduct, the use of a convicted criminal as an informant, the months of inducement, the targeting of a man in financial desperation, sufficiently troubling to conclude that the government had gone too far. DeLorean walked out of the courtroom a free man. He was also a ruined man. The legal fees had consumed what remained of his personal fortune. The DeLorean Motor Company was gone. The factory in Belfast was silent. The car existed only in the hands of collectors who had bought it before the collapse, and the enthusiasts who would, in the coming decades, maintain and restore the approximately 9,000 vehicles that had been produced before the end. John DeLorean spent the remaining 23 years of his life in the particular purgatory of a man who has been acquitted but not restored. He attempted comebacks. He announced new car projects that never materialized. He gave interviews in which he spoke about what had been done to him with the passionate certainty of a man who believed his own narrative completely. He was never entirely wrong about what had been done to him. The entrapment defense had been successful for a reason. The FBI's methods had been genuinely questionable, and the desperation that had made him vulnerable to them had been genuine. But he was never entirely right either. He had agreed to the cocaine deal. He had been in that hotel room. He had said the words that the cameras recorded. The truth, as it usually does in stories about complicated men, lived somewhere in the space between the story John DeLorean told about himself and the story the FBI told about him. He died on March 19, 2005. He was 79 years old. The cause of death was a stroke. The DeLorean DMC-12, the car that John DeLorean built with borrowed money in a factory in Belfast. The car with the gull-wing doors and the stainless steel body and the rear engine and the promise of the future, became, in the years after its creator's fall, something that he could not have planned and would not have predicted. It became a symbol, not of failure, though it had failed commercially, not of corruption, though it had ended in a hotel room with cocaine on the table, but of a particular American quality, the quality of the man who bets everything on his own vision and loses completely, and in losing demonstrates something about the nature of dreaming that success can never quite capture. When Back to the Future was released in 1985, 3 years after DeLorean's arrest, the film's director Robert Zemeckis chose the DMC-12 as the time machine, not despite its association with failure and scandal, but partly because of it. The car that was supposed to be the future, that had failed to be the future, that had ended in disgrace. It was the perfect vehicle for a story about time, about the gap between what we imagine and what actually happens, about the human need to go back and make things turn out differently. The DeLorean became immortal in a movie about second chances. John DeLorean never got his. 9,000 DeLoreans were built. Most of them are still on the road. The owners maintain them with devotion, track down parts that are increasingly difficult to find, gather at shows where the gull-wing doors rise simultaneously and the stainless steel catches the light, and for a moment it is possible to see what John DeLorean saw when he closed his eyes in 1973 and imagined the car he was going to build. The car of the future, built by a man who had no future left. And still, somehow, here,